Corruption or mishap, restore or reform, Burnham or Starmer. I'm Frank Mckenna. I'm joined this week by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, and this is the Downtown in Business Politics podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Welcome on this wonderful day of sunshine, and isn't it incredible that we had a bank holiday where it didn't piss down all weekend? But it wasn't all great fun because, unfortunately, West Ham were relegated. So condolences, Joe. And I have to apologise on behalf of Everton Football Club for our woeful display against Tottenham on Sunday. And we were poor, and we have been for some weeks. But at least we can draw a line under yet another forgettable football season as far as Everton, West Ham, and to a lesser extent, I guess, Plymouth are concerned. But let's get into the politics. And as ever,
bottom in November, nearly in the playoffs by May.
I did say to a lesser extent forgettable for you guys. I mean, if you want to play that game, Joe, Jim, we got an extra point this season than we did last season. It only cost us 150 million quid in the summer. So there you go. So this week, we're going to turn our attention to corruption in politics and whether or not certain issues that have been coming to the fore in recent times are being taken seriously enough, being covered up, or what the situation might mean for English and wider UK politics when you consider this scandalous case that has emerged in Scotland, where Peter Murrell, who was, of course, the husband of Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party for many years, and of course the First Minister for, I think it was about a decade, £400,000, lot of cash that he has admitted to embezzling when he was chief executive, I think, of the Scottish National Party. And the person who will know far more about this situation than Jim or I is Joe, because you produced for BBC the Scottish Conference series when you were just a wee lass, I'm sure, Joe. So tell us what you know, and tell us what we should be interested in terms of this scandal from Scotland.
Well, yes, so I did work for a number of years producing the coverage for BBC Scotland, so worked very closely with all the political parties up there, including the SNP, first of all with Alex Salmond as leader, and then with Nicola and Peter Murrell, who was was running the organisation. And I think, like many parties, but particularly the SNP, what you had was Alex Salmond, whose protege was Nicola Sturgeon, who then took over, became First Minister, and then Peter Murrell, who was Chief Executive, and they got married. So you've almost got this sort of dynastic political force in a way. And, I would say that Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has been and was and will be remembered as a very impressive politician. She stepped out of the shadow of Salmond, who was very charismatic and a great communicator, a flawed human being, but aren't we all? And she performed very well. I mean, there are those in Scotland who would argue that the SNP under her and since the beginnings of this scandal have not delivered as much as they promised, and there are very many questions about the SNP, but we know perfectly well that they're still the main party in Scotland. So this embezzlement that Peter Murrell, her estranged husband, has admitted to is from SNP funds. So it's not, if you like, taxpayer money going through Holyrood, But the questions that are now being asked is why didn't she notice, and how far is she implicated? I mean, not that it's going to have any effect on her because she's retired from politics, but there are huge questions about, didn't you think that was a little bit fishy, that you've suddenly got a high-end mobile home parked in your mum's driveway or whatever it was? But it was money, apparently, we are told, that was spent on luxury items, presumably in their house that they shared. And so there is a perfectly valid question about, didn't you ever wonder where this stuff was coming from? So, it's a shame because in some ways it will be, and it already has tarnished her very successful career and a long dedication to politics and public service in Scotland. But as is so often the case, as we all know, money and corruption quite often sees the end to very successful political careers.
Yeah, it does seem to stretch credibility, doesn't it, Jim, that Nicola Sturgeon wasn't aware that £400,000, an additional £400,000 was washing through the Sturgeon household. I'm not sure that the defence of I didn't know anything about it, Gov, would get a gangster's moll off, or so I do wonder. And we're talking about a highly intelligent woman here, somebody who doesn't lack the thing that we've often said our Prime Minister lacks, which is curiosity. And when you consider rightfully, the stick that the Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and others took just after the general election when it emerged that they'd taken free tickets, free suits, free glasses, that added up to a few £1,000. £400,000 going in and out of the house. I do find it, a little bit difficult to believe that Nicola Sturgeon wouldn't have sort of asked a few questions at least.
It's stretching credibility to its very greatest extent. I mean, I share Joe's admiration for her politics and the way, that she governed Scotland for quite a long time. But it did sort of fall apart, that unseemly wrangle with her former protege, Alex Salmond, the way she became completely obsessed with the issue of gender issues. But that was partly because she was dealing with the Green Party, to be fair. And then her sort of sudden resignation. I'm speaking from memory now, but she did suddenly announce her resignation. And it makes you wonder whether it was tied in with what she knew was starting to come on. I'll try and keep my answer as brief as possible, but I do have a number of points to make if you don't mind. I mean, the defence is that Murrell was on a pretty good salary and therefore they were used to the good things of life, but that doesn't account for, these extraordinarily extravagant salt cellars and things like that coming into the house. And to be fair to Sturgeon, she has been through the police process. Police Scotland have not found a case against her, so that's fair enough. But now let's move on to the slightly more political stuff. I mean, Joanne Cherry, the Scottish MEP, is a woman I've met actually and had a lot of time for. She was raising issues about the finances of the Scottish National Party a long time ago, and there was a culture of shutting things down, and Sturgeon was responsible for that. I mean, Joe might want to come back on this, both in political disagreements with her leadership or questions about the finances of the SNP. You were shut down, you were called a traitor and things like that, which is not healthy. The next point is, rightly or wrongly, having a husband who was the chief executive and a wife who was the leader of a party, not a great idea. However meritorious the people are, it's not good. And then the final thing is the timing of this. Now, I've looked into this a little bit. Because, I think, just stating my moral high ground thing, the people of Scotland were entitled for this case to have come on before the elections. So why is it a fortnight afterwards that it comes up? Now, there'll be all this stuff about the Scottish judicial system is completely independent and so on. But actually, there are quite a lot of lay people on the Scottish judicial system, and they, potentially could have been influenced. It seems very unsatisfactory to me. And finally, We now have the Aberdeen South by-election coming up, and I imagine that Kemi Badenoch, because apparently the Conservatives are quite strong in Aberdeen South, it'll be a very interesting by-election to take our attention from some other by-election that I can't remember. And very finally, Frank, you're being very kind to me. Where does this leave Scottish independence? Look at them. They want to be a free country, and they get involved in scandals like this. I think it's damaged Scottish independence.
That was 3 finalies there, Jim. So when we go over the half an hour that you two always say you manage to stick to when you're on your own, let's just remember this, yeah? 3 finalies in one statement. Our producer Francesca is nodding her head in absolute amazement, James.
You get injury time. After the injury time goes up, if you're going to have further injuries, you have even more injury time.
We'll have VAR next season for you, mate. Right, Joe, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, because, again, let's not forget, the Scottish National Party were so dominant in Scotland for, as I say, that decade. And Jim points out, it would ordinarily, I guess, in a political environment where you had parties who were nipping at your heels a bit more so than was the case in Scotland, a leader and a chief executive married would have caused, I think, a bit more controversy. So it was the problem to an extent, the fact that these guys just got a bit too powerful.
Yeah. Oh, and it's like I said before, it was a dynasty. And, in the same way that we have seen the effects of that, obviously, to a much worse degree in Syria, for instance, what happens when you get that power and it is passed through and there is nobody challenging it, or those that do challenge, as Jim's just said about Joanna Cherry, and it's closed down. It is not good. And I think, if it was happening in England, south of the border, and there was the same sort of makeup of the Conservatives or the Lib Dems or the Tories, and I'm sure we'll come on to reform in a minute when we're talking on this wider issue of dodgy dealings in politics, that there would have been bigger questions. And so I think, there's a whole question. I mean, I've always thought for many, many years that Scotland is much more politically literate than England, and that to a certain extent the sort of the tribalism of party politics, which is not so prevalent nowadays, but 20, 30 years ago, was always put to one side, if you like, in favour of Scotland. Scotland was more important than the tribes. And I remember when I worked for Paddy Ashdown, going up to Edinburgh and, having a dinner in Ming Campbell's house. And there was Ian Lang, that Jim will remember, former Scottish Secretary Robin Cook, Ming, obviously, Paddy, and people, and Donald Dewar, and people right across the political spectrum. And they were sort of the giants of Scottish politics, if you like. And I used to, just as a final little anecdote, I have spent many a happy afternoon in the House of Commons with Robin Cook and Alex Salmon watching the horse racing on Channel 4 with a bottle of whiskey and 40 packets and 40 fags. Those were the days.
40 packets of fags, probably.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But you see that, Jim? Just one finally there from Joe. Yeah, I do think that when you get that hegemony of a political party, then it can create problems of its own. I mean, we saw it with the Tories at the fag end of John Major's government, didn't we? With, a whole queue of Conservative MPs lining up to be caught up in scandals. Think Hamilton, Neil Hamilton, wasn't it, Jim?
Oh, yeah.
Tatton was probably the most high profile, but the many sort of Tory MPs who got to that stage, I think, after 18 years of Conservative government, it was at that time, he just thought they could get away with anything. And it seems to me that, within this particular sad story, particularly in relation to Nicola Sturgeon, who I agree with you is a very impressive politician and one whose legacy ought to be a positive one. But this story, I think, will go on and on because she will just continue to be bombarded with questions, won't she, as to what she knew, why she didn't know 400,000 extra pounds were going in and out of the household, as I say, yeah, it's a story that's not going to end, and maybe one we'll come back to in future episodes. But this leads us on to south of the border, and this question of a £5 million gift to Nigel Farage, which was initially, I think, described as a donation. He's been given this gift because of his 27 years campaigning for Brexit. I just can't wait to see what gift I'm going to be presented with after 30 years of campaigning for devolution when we finally get there in the north of England. But there you go. I mean, I can only dream about how much money people are going to have. What are these things that they do collecting online? Yeah, that's what we'll do for me. I'll probably get that's crowdfunding. Yeah, I'll probably get about 2 and 6, won't I? So £5 million for 27 years of campaigning, and that was the sort of one of several explanations that he's given for this cash. There was then the controversy over a home that he bought for £1.2 million, which he claimed initially had been paid for out of proceeds from his appearance on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, which many of us wish had been renamed I'm a Celebrity, Keep Me Here Forever. And then, of course, he's claimed that it's all outrageous anyway, because how did this pesky journalist from The Guardian get this information in the first place? Well, it's because my computer or my phone or one of my devices was hacked. Well, it doesn't really matter, Nigel, how the information was gleaned if you've been up to no good, mate. And, yeah, I do hope that the journalists who appear to have been doing a good job on this one stick with it and aren't thrown off and deflected by Farage's Trumpian approach to the matter. Jim, what have you made it of it all? Because it's been going on for 3 or 4 weeks now, this.
Yes, it has. I agree with you that sort of trying to sort of smear the investigative journalist with the sort of the Russian aspect of this is, it's playing.
It's all a bit Labour together, Jim, isn't it?
Well, I was just going to say, Josh Simon started to play the people who are investigating Labour together. You know, it's always a mistake to do that, especially with journalists, because they have the way of hitting back through the pen or the keyboard as it is nowadays. So there are these remaining, scandals, and then Robert Jenrick has also got questions to answer as well. The only point I would reiterate, and I've made this point before on podcasts, is that it doesn't seem to be having a huge effect on the support for Reform UK. We seem to be in this rather dangerous territory where people are accepting lower standards of public life, providing that they support the political party concerned. This famous thing about Trump saying he could shoot someone in the street and people would still vote for him. So I'm continue to be interested in it, but I'd be more interested if it was shifting the dial on Reform UK support. And I think those are the worrying aspects of it, that we seem to be seeing a public tolerance for things that in the past would lead to immediate resignations.
Well, we're not, are we? Because Keir Starmer took a hell of a kicking over that issue that I referenced a little earlier in terms of his free suits and specs. Rachel Reeves for taking free tickets to a concert. It's a big expose in that rag that nobody in Liverpool will buy about Andy Burnham, and the fact that he's had, I think it amounted to about him and his missus had about £17,000 of what they're describing as freebies. These are things I remember when I was in politics that often you get invited to. It's the last thing you want to do, but you drag yourself there because you've been invited and it's part of the job. But all of a sudden, these things are becoming freebies. I'm not suggesting that everything Andy Burnham has been to over the past 10 years has been a chore for him. I'm sure he did enjoy the Brits. But can you imagine any mayor of any city in anywhere in the world having an event like the Brits on and not being invited. So, it seems to me, Jim, that what we do have in this country, bizarrely, is double standards. So if you're from the left, then you shouldn't take a penny outside of your salary or your allowance. But if you're a right-wing lunatic, then you can do what you like. You're a charlatan. I shouldn't call him a lunatic. He's far from a lunatic, Nigel Farage. Maybe again, it just comes back to that ability to communicate, to come across as a bit of a lad. Well, I would do that, wouldn't I? Wouldn't you? If you had the chance, wouldn't you do that? Bit like Danny Kruger's defence, shameful defence of the Makerfield candidate, which we'll come on to in a second, in terms of suggesting that all working class blokes talk in a misogynistic way. I need to get Danny up to the north and introduce him to some of my working class mates, and we can show him what we think about that caricature. Won't be nice for you, Danny. But Joe, what do you make of this? Do you think Nigel Farage is going to come away from this scar-free? Because I do think this is cutting through a little.
No, I agree. And I think, there is that element of, oh, yes, for goodness sake, it's just him. Bit like Boris Johnson. Oh, we'll put up with that. The dodgy wallpaper, the £500,000 advance on a Shakespeare book that still hasn't been written or delivered. All of that, people will they'll go, oh, it's just him, he's just a lad. Frankly, that is the same defence of Danny Kruger's, that it's a bit of banter. No, it bloody isn't. It's wrong on every single level. And there's a huge difference between Andy Burnham or Keir Starmer taking a freebie, and we know what we all think about Keir Starmer and the stupidity of having suits and spectacles paid for by somebody else. But it's who gives you the money and what do they expect in return. Now, I think it's important to say that this very wealthy friend of Nigel Farage's, Christopher Harborne, he's British, but he has a Thai passport and he lives in Thailand. He's already given £15 million to the party to reform. This was a separate amount of money direct to Nigel Farage, as far as we understand, that should have been declared because he got it in the year preceding his election to Parliament. That's why it's being investigated by the parliamentary authorities. And that could lead to some sort of censure or potential suspension. But I think, whereas you can see exactly the same Trump deflection and the bristling and thin skin when pushed by journalists on something that you don't feel comfortable answering, what we've now seen is not only did the dog eat his homework, the dog was then sick and then came back and re-ate the homework. Because we've gone from this bonkers story about it was for his security. Okay, he was a private individual, and yes, he was having a lot of threats. Then we heard, after he became an MP, that his security detail had been cut by 75%, which then turns that bit into a lie because, well, hang on a minute, you said you hadn't got any security. He's also claimed, and this hasn't really been picked up on as much as I think it should be, that the police have advised him for his own safety not to hold constituency surgeries. Well, any self-respecting journalist from the Clacton Gleaner could actually ask to see that evidence. And if it doesn't exist, then that is a complete lie. And, there are other questions as to why he doesn't do constituency surgeries. But then changing the story and again saying, how did they get this news? Well, it was the filthy Russians. They hacked my phone. But you haven't reported it to the police, the House of Commons, any of the security agencies. And the former head of National Cyber Security Intelligence said this, frankly, is implausible because, joking aside at how utterly ridiculous it is, if it is true, then there are huge implications for all British politicians, whether that's coming from Russia or China or Iran or other hostile states. And the authorities need to know and need to be able to operate. So, on so many levels, Nigel Farage has failed, either to be upfront about what the money's for. There are all sorts of, I mean, he's a very wealthy man, but, you know, and as we know, he declares his earnings outside of Parliament in the MP's register. But I do think that this one might be beginning to cut through. And I think that, coupled with his former best mate, Elon Musk, now backing Rupert Lowe, and Restore Britain, which is, you know, makes Reform look like the Liberal Party, that's not helping either. And the questions that are constantly being lobbied and the inability of people like Danny Kruger to answer them or to condemn, you know, how many Reform councillors were elected only a couple of weeks ago who've already had to stand down or be suspended, including the one who thought he was going to Westminster.
I think that, you know, to unpick just some of that, Joe, and to look at where this leaves us when you zoom out from the situation of Farage's £5 million, is that he's left the stage for a few weeks. He's obviously felt uncomfortable in terms of the scrutiny he was getting over this. And of course, what this has then enabled is for the Danny Krugers and the Robert Jenricks to be given more airtime. And what that will do, I think, is remind people that this is not the Nigel Farage show, that we have political parties who fund governments in this country. We don't have a president. I think the more people see of Jenrick, the more people see of Kruger, the more people see some of those other, should I put it, unsavoury characters from across the Reform Party and the Reform movement, the less attractive a proposition it becomes. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody rushes back to the traditional two mainstream parties of the Conservatives and Labour. And we are perhaps starting to see that there may be this huge shift in the British electorate rightwards, or at least to any insurgent party that is seen as a genuine alternative to Labour and Conservatives. So when we come back after this short break, finally, we will be talking about the Makerfield by-election, where we're up to with that, and the emergence of potentially another party to the right, Restore. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank Mckenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And we're going to turn our attention to that Makerfield by-election, which of course has been followed very carefully, not simply because it's important in respect of who will represent the Greater Manchester seat moving forward and will give a further indication potentially of how people are perceiving the government's performance. But of course, if the Labour candidate, Andy Burnham, wins, then it's fully expected that he will go on to challenge Keir Starmer for the position of Prime Minister. But in the news this week, as much as Andy Burnham and his bomber jackets and his freebies that weren't really freebies, we've seen the spotlight shining on the Reform candidate, Rob Kenyon, and some absolutely despicable, outrageous tweets that he made. Initially, those that emerged were about Carol Vorderman, and credit to her, she unearthed them and rightly highlighted them on various social media posts that she put out, and I think she may have done a couple of television interviews. And then Danny Kruger, as I mentioned in the first part of the programme, was absolutely skewered by a BBC journalist, BBC Radio 4, I think it was. May have that wrong. Jim will correct me if I have. And he was absolutely squirming, but made the fatal mistake of trying to defend that language and that narrative. And I think this is why, as I said earlier, Reform's shine will come off if it's left to people like Kruger, who sees these sort of tweets, and I'm not going to repeat them on this podcast. Don't mind a bit of effing and jeffing, but some of the stuff that was mentioned in Rob Kenyon's tweeting was, as I say, absolutely sickening, really. Jim, you listened to the interview, I think. Tell us the journalist's name and tell us your sort of reflections on that interview.
Well, this was Emma Barnett on the Today programme, and
the Today programme. Sorry.
Yeah, she explicitly used the words, which I'm entirely sure about, but she would defend it by saying, people have got to understand the realities of what women have to face. And I think the broader issue is that Reform, I think, are trying to steer stay on a tightrope here, and the Kruger's fallen off. I think the truth of the matter is they have to dissociate themselves from these comments in some way or another, either blaming the whole of the working class in the north of England because they all working class men talk like that, or saying it was a long time in the past. But the general shtick of Nigel Farage and the Reform is, this drinking in the pubs and all this sort of stuff, is to nod to that section of the community that it'll be all right on the night, and at least one of us. There are ways for politicians, and we'll discuss Andy Burnham's approach to this later on. There are ways for politicians to identify as one of us, and it sometimes goes horribly wrong. But one of them isn't to try and associate working class people with that sort of behaviour.
Yeah, I just thought the defence was ridiculous. He'd have been far better to come on and say, well, of course, they were absolutely outrageous comments. He shouldn't have made them. He's apologised. Let's move on. To try and defend it on the basis that, as you say, Jim, every working class bloke in the north of England talks that way, demonstrates Danny Kruger's total lack of intelligence to a point, I think, but in terms of his perception of the north of England. But also, I think it's an insult to working class blokes in the north of England, isn't it? Joe, you've spent enough time in the north of England to know that we don't all walk around like misogynistic wankers talking that way.
Do you remember when Emily Thornberry got pilloried for putting up a picture of a white van with a Union flag on it, and was called a snob and all the rest of it for sneering at the working class? It is utterly ridiculous. And Danny Kruger, who actually is an intelligent man,
I don't think he is, Joe.
Well,
Can I just interject there? I don't think he is. I think Danny Kruger is somebody who knows a lot of big words, who speaks with a plum in his mouth, and therefore comes across, on occasion, to the Westminster bubble as an intelligent man. There is nothing I have seen Danny Kruger say or do that has impressed me. He was part of Johnson's crowd, wasn't he, at one point?
Yes, he was. I mean,
for me, I think you've got to go actions rather than words. And he comes across as presentable, but I've seen him. Was he on Question Time recently?
I think so.
I think I saw him getting battered on that, and then this journalist has absolutely skewered him the other day. I don't think he's an impressed politician at all. I'd have to disagree with you.
Fair enough. But I mean, he's certainly one. I think that's a fair point. But he's not. Has not been somebody to normally knee-jerk like Lee Anderson, for instance. He comes across as more thoughtful. But the other thing that he said in defence of this bloke in Makerfield was that he was making private comments as an ordinary man.
On Twitter.
If you think that going online on social media is private, then actually, Frank, you're quite right. He's not very intelligent. He's an absolute idiot. And I think this whole social media stuff, either don't go on it or shut up or take a breath before you put something there, because it is going to come back and haunt you, whether that's you want to be in politics or whether you are going for a job interview. Just stop and think, and this attitude. And this is where I think Reform might also beginning to go, because there are not a lot of their supporters are sort of white working class people who are going to go, hang on a minute, I wouldn't let somebody say that about my daughters or my wife or my mother, and I certainly wouldn't say it, and nor would my workmates, and nor would my sons or brothers. So it is that awful sort of, oh, you must forgive these people, they don't know any better. Well, you know, that's insulting on so many levels. I suspect there might be more to come about this Kenyan bloke, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's a big discussion today, isn't there? Because last day of consultation in terms of banning social media for under 16s. I think a lot of under 16s will be reading these tweets and saying, well, you should ban social media for people who are over 16, never mind under 16. But no, I just sticking with the Kruger thing. I think one of the reasons why he's maintained this perception of being an intelligent politician is because he's never really had exposure. You know, he's produced policy papers. He's seen as a bit of a policy and ideas wonk, and then he gets called on to the likes of Radio 5 and the Today programme and has a very gentle conversation about his latest right-wing idea. But he's never been pressed or pushed on situations where what is required is a degree of common sense. And that's what I think he lacks. And he's not the only person in Westminster who lacks common sense. But I think the more, as I said previously, that the likes of him and Jenrick are exposed to the media, the better it will be for the other political parties, but not necessarily for Labour and the Conservatives, because what we're seeing in Makerfield is an uptick in support for Lowe's party, Rupert Lowe's party, Restore, which, if anything, is further to the right of reform. What are you making of that, Jim? Is this just further evidence that people are totally fed up with the system as it is? They just want to rip it up and start again.
Bottom really between Farage and Lowe as to how many people they'd like to expel. More significantly, Elon Musk now seems to be more attracted to Restore UK. The point about in Makerfield is that it could be a close election, although I've got just something to say about the Labour lead, which is meant to be only 3%. But just before I make that point, it could be a close run thing, and a few points for Restore UK could make all the difference. Certainly, Reform are worried. The amount of vituperation that's going on between Reform and Restore UK is incredible. I mean, there's personal animosity between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. You know, it's this tall poppy syndrome problem that they had when they were, just after the general election, and they couldn't work together. So there's a lot of that is motivating it, but it could be politically significant if a few points count for it. Just my last point is that there is this poll done by Survation, which shows that Andy Burnham's only 3 points up. But I have seen some analysis of that, which concerns the fact that the question upon which that is based was, would you vote Labour? And then it doesn't take into account, would you vote for Andy Burnham, where the figures are more promising for Labour. And I think, we've already talked about Rob Kenyon's unfortunate posts. I sense it's great to have a plumber and all this sort of stuff, but I sense Kenyon's going to be overwhelmed by the Burnham machine and Burnham will win. So there's my reckless forecast, ready to be shot down on June the 19th.
Well, that's due Andy Burnham, hasn't it?
It's still waiting for Tom Cleverly to become Prime Minister.
And Conservative
leader. So Andy, I do apologise. Yeah, let's just stick with this Restore thing for a second. Joe, tell us a bit more about what Rupert Lowe's party stand for. Is there a significant shift to the right from Farage's Reform? It seems incredible to say that, but I believe they are to the right of Farage and Reform.
Yeah, I think they are more outrageous. I mean, both Reform and Restore are basically political parties based on slogans. slogans. So it's, restore as mass deportations, get rid of woke culture, save the British pub, British energy. It's all the sort of the usual stuff, and probably go back to pounds, shillings and pence, and, put children up chimneys and all of that sort of thing that they love to do. And they haven't really got any policies, and they haven't really been held to scrutiny. But I believe Rupert Lowe is people quite like him. He's a sort of florid-faced, bluff Englishman, that sort of person you'd find jangling the keys in their pocket, by a fire in an English pub somewhere with some wet Labradors beside him. So I think he's got that sort of ability to connect in the same way that Farage has. And I think, as reform has become bigger and is now a tribute band to the former Conservative Party, with a whole load of, odd bods and lunatics from across the spectrum who are councillors and whatnot. I think, Restore in a way is under less scrutiny, but I saw some figures and polling that they're getting about 7% in Makerfield. Now that is a significant dent. That's enough to split the Reform vote. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats aren't anywhere in this. And as Jim said, Elon Musk has come out to support Rupert Lowe, which he's done in the past, much to the chagrin of Mr. Farage, who used to be best buddies with Elon. So I think it's quite interesting. If the shine comes off reform, would be reform voters. Well, they're probably not going to go Conservative. They're certainly going to go Labour or Green. So they might go Restore. So I think, again, it's another illustration of the fragmentation of politics, but it's also, unfortunately, another emphasis on the fact that none of these people have got any serious policies. It is just slogans.
Yeah, I think, as I say, it's a bit more than that, isn't it? It's people who are demonstrating their total disillusionment with mainstream political parties, and they want insurgents, they want outsiders, which is what I think, ironically, will play well for Andy Burnham, because he's been out of Parliament for 10 years. Now, OK, we can all sort of chuckle and say, well, yeah, Andy, but you're in government, you're part of the new Labour machine. You then took a place in Gordon Brown's government. You were also part of the shadow cabinet under Jeremy Corbyn. I presume he had a shadow job under Miliband as well, didn't he, at some point? I'm sure he must have. So, for Andy to sort of sell himself as an outsider, I think is further evidence that he's a bloody good politician. He's able to act the chameleon at times when it's necessary, but he will be seen as the insurgent if he wishes to sell himself in that way. And bizarrely, I understand that one of the slogans going around the field, a bit mischievously, is, vote Burnham, get rid of Starmer.
Yeah.
So I think he's got a lot going for him, as Andy Burnham. And I know that you had a chat about Andy and Wes and others last week in terms of potential leadership challenges, and I suspect that we wouldn't, for all sorts of reasons, not least manifesto commitments, see a huge shift in terms of Labour policy if Andy Burnham became Prime Minister by the autumn, which I if I was a betting man, would put money on, I think, at this moment in time. But the fact is that he's human. He's a good communicator. He's used this slogan, Andy for us, which I think, again, is a clever piece of marketing because he's one of us. And a point you made earlier, Jim, you don't have to be a total arsehole to be somebody who relates to ordinary people. And I think Andy Burnham has got that in spades, to be fair to him, which is why I suspect, for once, your prediction of potentially a more comfortable win than are being predicted in some of the polls is highly likely for Andy Makerfield.
Yeah, and it is, essentially his part of the world. I mean, Lee was very nearby, and Andy is always, and this is one of the refreshing things about Andy's his relationship with Steve Rotherham in the Liverpool City region, that and try to work in the interest of both of them, and that's partly because Andy, is an Everton supporter, and Mayfield's right on the far west of Greater Manchester. So, he's authentically from that part of the world. Just to, if I may slightly move on the agenda, the thing that struck me in the last week is, Makerfield's still right up there in the headlines, and the place is crawling with journalists who are all moving into Ashton in Makerfield. Maybe they'll find Abram and Hindley before long. There are other towns and communities in the constituency.
Much nicer to knock around Ashton.
Yeah, not far from Up Holland. I noticed the boundary goes right up to Up Holland,
I think, isn't it?
Yeah,
bordered on the constituency I represented. Yeah,
indeed. But meanwhile, the government go on governing. We have had these things. I know
before
they're
we do that, before you go on, let me just stick with Andy Burnham, because I think one of the things that we underestimate is the fact that we do know these people on a personal level, some better than others. But you must have met Andy Burnham dozens and dozens of times through that changing career, as a up-and-coming MP when he was first elected in Lee, through to his positions in Cabinet, Treasury Minister, of course, then NHS, then his intervention in Hillsborough, which really did, I think, catapult him into the national media psyche, but also obviously got him an awful lot of credit, and rightly so, in the north of England, and with Liverpool and Everton supporters in particular, I guess. Then, of course, his attempt to win the leadership of the Labour Party on 2 occasions now, and fail, but then morph into this huge champion of Greater Manchester and the most well-known mayor in the UK, I think even more so than Sadiq Khan. So you've had, as I say, lots of personal interaction with Andy Burnham. Tell me what you think about him.
Yeah, they on Northwest Tonight the other evening, they actually played a very short section of my first interview with him, and I had him on my political show in 2001, when he was, he was quite nervous and inexperienced. So I have watched his career with interest right the way through, and there is, this criticism, these all things to all men, and 3 people went into a pub, and what are you having, Mr. Burnham, and all this sort of stuff. But a certain amount of political flexibility is necessary. But he did serve in the cabinet. He did see fit to work under Corbyn, but then so did Keir Starmer. The Hillsborough thing, of course, you will remember that he went to Anfield with a speech prepared for him by Jack Straw, who was taking a very cautious approach on Hillsborough. And Andy was delivering a speech which was basically, I'm crudely putting this now, telling the people, the campaigners, to take it easy. The government were doing what they could, but don't overfill your expectations. And the booing started, and you almost saw the transformation take place at Anfield during that speech. And then, you're quite right, he then switched and took the line that he did. Then we come on, then he left Parliament and made a big thing about coming to Manchester and the mayoralty. And obviously everything's coming under scrutiny now. And I would say about his mayoralty, he's absolutely done the job that city region mayors were meant to do, advocating for their area. The COVID thing, what are they doing to us? His track record more locally, you can scrutinise it. The B buses, has been really good. But we mustn't forget the Clean Air Act thing, which didn't go down at all well, particularly in places like Makerfield. That the regeneration of Greater Manchester has been heavily concentrated on the city centre of Manchester. Places like Oldham and so on, Andy hasn't managed to get to. He's done stuff on rough sleepers. The housing strategy didn't work. So it's a mixed picture. But this King of the North thing has stuck because of his political acumen. But, the question will be, and I have, you've been kind enough to say I've known him a long time, will be if he gets to number 10, every day things are piling in. When you're a city region mayor, you can, you're an essential, one of the people advocating for better Manchester. He's got to run the country and he's going to make unpopular decisions. And I'm not sure how Andy is going to deal with the need to make difficult decisions if he becomes Prime Minister.
Thanks, James. I mean, again, I obviously know him arguably a little bit better than you. Obviously, we've knocked about the political circuit for a long time together. He's very kindly given his time generously to Downtown in Business over the years, many different events that we've hosted. I think we were the first organisation to host a joint event with Andy and Steve Rotherham, which was informative and entertaining in equal measure, as you can imagine. The football conversation is always high on our agenda because we've more in common as far as Everton Football Club are concerned in terms of in comparison to our politics, because what I will acknowledge is he's now slightly to the left of where I am, but he's not that much further to the left. And what I think Andy Burnham is a pragmatic politician with instinct. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if he was still trying to trot out the lines from 40 years ago and say the world hasn't changed in 4 decades, and what I'm going to do is start to preach the new Labour mantra and continue along those lines, well, he'd be an absolute dope, wouldn't he? Because we've seen a huge transformation in terms of the world and in terms of the country. So when people say to me, Andy Burnham's moved his position on things, well, bloody right he hasn't, and so I think we all have. Because the world has changed. So he's absolutely, for me, not to be criticised for that. And his big plus, and this is what I think will get him to number 10 sooner rather than later, assuming he does win the Makerfield by-election, is that thing, Joe, that we've shook our heads in despair over the last 2 years, that Keir Starmer has lacked in space, which, as I say, is political instinct and a pragmatic approach to issues and that ability to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that ability to communicate makes it so much easier to tell people, the public, when you're making difficult decisions, because they'll take it from you, because it's not going to be couched in, processology, as Kemi Badenoch is always accusing Keir Starmer of doing. And I think, pragmatism is really important. And I obviously don't know Andy Burnham like you two do, but on the few times that I have met him, I've always found him very open, very willing to sort of, he never feels like he's rushing off to something. I remember a Downtown dinner where he came and he'd been delayed on the train, but he wasn't rushing off, and he took questions from people, and he was really good. And it was the mental health thing that we did with Trevor. And the other thing I would say, I know Jim is a great flag bearer for Andy Street, but when Andy Street was mayor of the West Midlands, Conservative, Andy Street and Andy Burnham worked really closely together on the whole HS2 debacle, and I think that ability to work with other people, but above all, he is human. And in the politics that we have got in front of us, if he does get to number 10 and he gets good people round him, which Keir Starmer has failed to do, he is immediately, he's got 3 months, he's got a bounce where people will go, he's great, he's so refreshing, he can do what he likes within reason, and he's in a position to say to the Parliamentary Labour Party, we're going to make some tough decisions, but if we don't do it our way, the other lot are going to make it far worse. So come on, let's do it. Let's get our mojo back and let's talk to people and be willing to change tack. It's not always a bad thing to do a U-turn. It's just when you do it 16 times because you haven't thought through what the process was that it looks ridiculous. So, we'll see. I think the other we haven't mentioned is the Greens. Now, Caroline Lucas, who was the one and only Green MP for such a long time, another very impressive politician, she has pretty much said the Greens need to sort of stand aside in Makerfield to not split the left-wing vote. Now, I don't think the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats are going to be campaigning particularly hard. We've already talked about restore and reform. But if the Greens were to somehow or other, having lost one candidate within hours, they've now announced another one today, a local councillor. You know, if they were, and this will be a test of Polanski, is he big enough and bold enough to say, for progressive Britain, we need Andy Burnham to win? Because it's a battle between Labour and Reform. There's nobody really else in it. And, you know, I think that's where the really sort of interesting bit will happen, whether people are willing. And I think, you know, why wouldn't you have Andy Burnham?
Well, I think one of the interesting propositions from Andy Burnham, which he would, I think, put in a future Labour manifesto if he was Labour leader, is proportional representation, electoral reform. So, you know, that would be, I'm sure, something that the Greens would support. At one time, it's something Nigel Farage was a supporter.
Well, and
he's not quite as keen these days.
The other thing I'd say is that, you know, Andy Burnham is a bloody good advert for devolution.
Yeah.
You know, and that's really important, because that has got to be, as we've said umpteen times, the way forward.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jan. I think that, you know, crucially is an area where he would be determined to make progress. But at that point, you know, the reason I think that I don't think he's always been an advocate of electoral reform, but I think the role of mayor has basically forced him, in a sense, not to be as tribal as you inevitably are as a Labour politician, because even within Greater Manchester, from time to time, there's been leaders of other boroughs from different political parties. And then, as you say, he's had to work with people from the West Midlands, and the mayor there, Andy Street, was a Conservative on the HS2 issue. So I think this idea of working alongside other political parties doesn't faze him as much as it perhaps once did, and he brings a more refreshing outlook to that sort of approach to politics. But Jim, I did interrupt you. You're about to take us on from the by-election or into another sphere of that by-election.
I just wanted to say that meanwhile, the government does carry on, and I just sort of sense, I mean, it may be because we're in recess at the moment, but that feverish momentum for, you know, I must get Andy back to Makerfield. Andy must immediately challenge Keir Starmer. I just want to, you know, just make my point, and you two may disagree with me, that this week has felt rather different from last week. And, you know, the government still have that power to, you know, to some extent control the political agenda, and the announcements on, you know, the fact that we're not going to get the 5p on the fuel, children's buses free in August, amusement parks, I think VAT is coming off that, you know, bits and pieces, of course. But and of course, at the moment, growth figures, immigration figures, inflation figures are showing a better picture, you know, that, and I have heard over the weekend, you know, Labour loyalists to Starmer saying, you know, we always knew it would be a slow process. We haven't still been in office for 2 years. Some of the things that we've put in place are beginning to show through. So I just wanted to, you know, hear what you guys have got to say about, you know, that it might lead Starmer to say, even more than his personal conviction to be stubborn, hang on a minute, you know, things are beginning to turn, and I'm damned if I'm not going to contest Andy Burnham if he decides to stand. But you may disagree.
No, I think that there's a case to be made as far as that's concerned. I would say that Starmer is now being treated by the media, though, as a caretaker prime minister, and therefore is not going to get the scrutiny and the stick that he was getting for the previous 20 months of his regime, which often I think has been unfair and over the top. And we'll have to see whether a more charismatic, more media-friendly Prime Minister, the likes of Andy Burnham or indeed Wes Streeting will be, gets an easier ride. I have some scepticism as to whether that will be the case, such as the makeup of the media in this country at the moment. However, we know that, you know, with clever social media and clever communications, you can be your own. You can create your own personal brand that can cut through that sort of media, newspaper, and even television bias these days. So I think, Jim, that it would be daft to simply write Keir Starmer off entirely, because he clearly wants to stay on as Prime Minister and will do all he can to remain in number 10. But I think the situation we find ourselves in the moment is a little bit artificial, in that people are simply waiting for the results of the Makerfield election. And then I think the fever pitch of we need a new leader will start again. And we know that Wes Streeting has already indicated he wishes there to be a leadership contest. And, again, like you, I speak to people in and around Wes's camp. I have no reason to disbelieve that he does have more than 81 MPs ready to back him if he so chooses to go for a leadership bid. So I think it will start up again, whatever the government do during this period, because we're in recess. It's a bit of a lull, and people are looking at this, Joe, as the fag end of Keir Starmer's government anyway.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I think once Parliament goes back and we get into the hurly-burly of Prime Minister's questions and all the rest of it, I think it will all come back again. And then there will be, inevitable scrutiny on the various candidates in Makerfield. And then there will be, you can guarantee it, if Keir Starmer goes, we've got to have a general election. But meanwhile, we're coming up to the 10th anniversary of the joyous day of Brexit, where you sort of think, wouldn't it be nice if they came out? I mean, and so far, Wes Streeting's the only one that's come out really clearly. And I think that's quite interesting too, but still, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, the Westminster bubble will be back in operation in a couple of weeks' time, and Downtown in Business will be there. We have our Liverpool City Region Parliamentary Reception on the 10th of June. And if you want to come along and meet your favourite podcasters, well, I'm afraid Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart and Emily Mason will not be in the room, but myself, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips will, as will the leader of Liverpool City Council, Liam Robinson, as will Minister for Local Government and Housing, Alison McGovern, many other MPs from across the Merseyside area, and peers too, and of course 80 or so business leaders from the Downtown Network. So if you're interested in coming along to that parliamentary reception June the 10th, please do go on to our website, allthewsdowntowninbusiness.com, and book your tickets. Before then, on the 5th of June, we have our second annual Cheshire and North Wales Business Awards, and we have quite literally 8 tickets remaining. It's been a fabulously successful event from last year, and moving forward, it's obviously seen as a popular thing to attend, and we're looking forward to converging on Chester Racecourse in a couple of weeks' time, hoping the weather sticks with us. And lots of other things happening in June as well. Liverpool International Tennis Tournament, Downtown in Business's 23rd anniversary party. Would you believe it, Jim? 23. Flipping heck, you were just drawing your pension for the first year then, weren't you, mate?
I was.
And then on to July, when we have the City of Liverpool Business Awards at the Palm House. Another interesting event, this was something, well, 2 actually that I want to mention that will interest you guys, I think. On the 4th of June, we've got Andy Street coming to Liverpool with his new organisation, Prosper UK, which of course is trying to put a little bit of wind in the sails of One Nation conservatism. So he's coming to Liverpool with his team, and we're going to be talking all things professional services and business with Andy. And then 26th of June, I think it is, we're heading up to Lancashire. Now, this is an event that you will really be interested in, James, because we've got the Conservative and Labour candidates, mayoral candidates for Cheshire, coming across to Lancashire to tell Lancashire why they need to get their act together and go for a mayoral candidate, because at the moment Lancashire's digging its heels in still and maintaining this position that they want devolution but without a mayor. So you need to try and get along to that one, Jim, not just come into the frivolous events such as the bloody tennis and the parliamentary reception.
I've got to go, Frank, unfortunately, but thank you.
Well, finally, Jim is off, and so is Joe, and so am I. So we will see you all again next Monday for our next episode of this podcast. And as I say, try and join us in Parliament as well. Fran's cracking the whip. Jim's got to go. Thanks for listening as ever. Have a great 7 days, or in this case, 6 days, everybody.